Okay, it is 11:02 and we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a couple of technical issues. So if you come across any problems during the course of the webinar, please chat to our host today. And if the chat button doesn't appear, it should be on the bottom of your screen. And if you sort of look at the three dots on the right side, if you don't see the chat box, you'll find it there as well. And please, at the end of today's webinar, complete our brief survey to give us some ideas for topics that you'd like us to cover in this area and or others. And just to be clear, during the course of the webinar today, please chat in your comments or questions as you go along. And we'll compile those and hold those to the end of the presentation for our Q&A period. So with that said, let's get started. So on behalf of the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Power Sharing Through Radical Curiosity, Engaging Youth in Care. And the topic of power sharing is so critical for clinical practice and is consistent with all of the approaches to care that we often aspire to engage in, like person-centered, recovery-oriented care, trauma-informed care, anti-oppressive or anti-racist care. You know, the question is, are we truly able to engage in power sharing, both as clinicians and also in the settings in which we work? So today's presentation and discussion will focus on power sharing through the concept of radical curiosity. My name is Jim Rodriguez. I'm the Director of Trauma-Informed Services at the CTAC and the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research, and I'll be moderating this webinar. And our presenter today is Dr. Deidre Williams, who will offer her thoughts about power sharing through what she terms radical curiosity. Dr. Williams holds a doctorate in social welfare with a concentration in social work from New York University. She's a skilled clinical and forensic social worker with a specialty in working with court-involved individuals and youth. In all her work, Deidre employs a level of mindfulness and commitment to the treatment process to create settings that respect all identities. Again, these are terms that we often refer to and think about, but do we actually practice them? Her hands-on approach creates a space for understanding, validation, and curiosity about the narratives and lived truths of others to build accountability and address patterns of internal and transgenerational discords. I want to thank Dr. Williams for sharing her perspective today, and I know you'll benefit from her practiced wisdom. With that said, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Deidre Williams.
Thank you, Jim. As a young child in my family, I was considered what we would know as mischievous. I would often reframe it with being curious. I used to tinker with a lot of little objects, and I would often see that someone would come, an adult would come, and I would have to quickly find a way to put it back together before they realized that I had broken this thing apart. Because it was so important for me to understand why things work and how do they work together. And so that's actually something that has prompted me into this field, but it's also prompted me into thinking a lot more about how can we be radically curious in this setting, in this profession. So good morning to everybody, and thank you to Jim and NYU McSilver for having me today. My name is Deidre Williams, and I specialize in working with court-involved individuals and persons with a history of homelessness, child welfare placements, and confinement through psychiatric hospitalizations, juvenile detentions, and adult jails and prisons. So I think that my work is really based on the foundation of mindfulness, commitment, and respect to the treatment process. It's rooted me in finding ways to dismantle concepts of privilege and power in systems. And as a curious person myself, I was led to ask questions of why does oppressive practices exist? And what could be helpful to repair the systemic injustices? Working from the same set of assumptions will not lead us to the resolution. For example, we are the crux in the world now in a new reality post-COVID and telehealth, where these vertical structures are no longer serving anyone. And we've learned as a society that we can create various work models and accommodate the needs of people while still supporting the structures of the institution. This is where radical curiosity comes in. How do we be able to build these new ways for us to be together as a community? So by the time a child is 3 years old, they already know all the unwritten rules of their family. Mom makes them breakfast in the morning, dad might get them dressed, take them out to the park, they might play with their siblings. And this is same to the unwritten rules of our systems. Just like the 3-year-olds, we all understand those unspoken rules of the power dynamics that exist within these systems. Power. Who has it? Who does not? Who's allowed to speak? Who is not? There are evident rules of perceived privilege and power that exist within our society despite the various principles that we uphold. In my practice and research, I found that many of the societal values and systemic practices are not aligned because they are deeply rooted in oppressive beliefs and implicit biases, which counteract our communal agreements. As a result, we are intentionally and unintentionally ostracizing people from accessing their power, and ultimately ownership of their own personhood and narrative of their own lives. I wholeheartedly believe there is a way that we can reimagine community. And a means for us to do this is through radical curiosity, a practice for us to extend mindfulness, flexibility, recognizing the risks are important to consider, but also remaining open to beliefs and contextualizing others' behaviors. To be radically curious is a fundamentally self-reflective process about your own internal preconceived notions, values, and how it is exhibited through practices on a micro, meso, and macro level. Particularly in my experience in the juvenile courts in New York City, several practices are not reflective of our morals. Treatment of non-white youth are different from white youth. And I often noticed that there was a disproportionate minority representation within the court systems. I saw that we routinely and systematically penalized non-white youth aged 7 to 17 at higher rates than white youth. Even though the total overall non-white youth population nationally is 38%. Juvenile delinquency cases rose to about 58% non-white youth in 2018. In addition to criminalizing Black and Brown youth at higher levels, there is clear evidence of disparate treatment. In September 2019, only 32 states and the District of Columbia implemented rules, statutes, and administrative orders to limit or prohibit indiscriminate shackling of youth, despite the research conveying the harms it poses. We know that shackling for adults is considered useful for those who are considered flight risks. But for a young person, it's not clear why we're still using these practices, despite the fact that we understand that youth perceive themselves as being bad or not in control of themselves or even dangerous when they're being shackled. Additionally, in 2018, there were about 12,000 youth serving life imprisonment sentences across the country. 80% of those were youth of color, 50% were Black. Again, I want to remind you that the overall non-white youth population is 38%. And if we say that our practices are aligning with our values and aligning with the percentage, wouldn't those percentages be closer in number than where they are today? The juvenile legal system should be based on a foundational understanding that the children need to be treated humanely and with age-appropriate consequences. That children also need to be treated differently from adults and they need special protection. The juvenile courts were established in 1899 in Chicago for the same very value. And we understand as a society that shaping young people into responsible adults is equally important, that we want to teach young people to develop a moral code, to ask them to make amends for when they make a mistake, but also to demonstrate it in action, not just in their words. But in what ways are we reflecting that as a society and through our practices? We are so solution focused that we often bypass the root of the problem in an effort to address it effectively. The theories that arose in the systems are not predicated on holistic, rehabilitative efforts for Black and Brown youth. These theories further reinforce criminality and racially encoded language and practices. Even reform efforts focus on approaches that are likely to improve outcomes and bridge practice to research gaps where data is lacking. But racial biases and prejudices inhibit system-wide changes. Ultimately, these biases impede the reform efforts. So we know that these systems are rooted in oppressive practices. They are entangled in it. We don't always see them, but we know that they're there. The same way that a youth may be rooted in strengths, but the focus in court is primarily on risk. There is a zealous oversight for service users in mental health. One environment is sending all these messages of dominance are underlining many of our systems. And because of the work in many of the systems that I've been in and the harm that I've witnessed, I would love for people to think more critically around the values that we profess that are guiding our practices. Oppressive practices extend to many institutions, including our mental health system. As much as we would like to think that we are in a helping profession, oftentimes our own biases are also a source that causes harms for other people. We often forget that there is a disconnect between providers and consumers at a fundamental level, which is impacted by underlining privilege and power. We as workers can forget that we are an arm of the system, and therefore there's a perception of power and privilege in working relationships, despite your positionality of privilege we experience in our own natural lives. We have the power of the pen. Our documentation in many cases gives us an advantage to impact the trajectory of someone's life, whether involuntarily hospitalizing someone, impacting the next working relationship by indicating that someone is too aggressive to treat, although the behavior may have been linked to inappropriate care, or even indicating that someone is non-compliant to court-mandated services, which could shift from a treatment mindset to a carceral setting. We have to be mindful of the narratives we are trying to convey about others. By creating authentic connections, there needs to be clear understanding and deconstruction of our own internal biases that impact quality care. It is much easier said than done, because we can work with some very challenging cases as well. Radical curiosity comes from raising the awareness in a means to increase connectedness to another human being. This can be challenging for providers because as providers, we can get stuck in the narratives of the casework and forget that we are providing a service. Many of us have been trained to not self-disclose to our clients, but we often fail to realize that in working in a people profession, that our clients impact us more than we realize. Because everybody who walks through the door is a mirror to a part of us that we are working on. Radical curiosity promotes engagement in building relationships, and interest in connecting shows vulnerability. We become who we are through our relationships, through how others perceive us, and interact with us, and how we make meaning of those social interactions. So, wanted to go through some of the principles of radical curiosity. I know that this is definitely a newer concept. And it's so simple, right? These are things that we are trained to do. But like I said, a lot of the times that we believe in certain beliefs, but they are not reflective in our practices. And so I want to encourage everyone to take a step back to really do some deep diving around how are you showing up in the work? And what are the things and the factors that are creating barriers for yourself to be able to provide quality care for the individuals that we serve? Like I said before, this is a very self-reflective practice. The first thing that you have to do is to become radically curious about yourself, doing an internal deep dive, really just about how are you showing up? What are the messages that you've been receiving throughout your life? Then the next thing would be to be radically curious about the people that we serve. If I were to sit in another position, or if I were another person in their lives, would I see them differently? And how does my lens impact how I'm viewing them? Also, we have to be radically curious with those that we work with in our agencies. How are we showing up, not only with our coworkers, but also our supervisors or supervisees, with the management team? And then the last bit would really just be radically curious at a macro level, really about how are the institutions creating systems to support those in our communities, in our working professions. Again, we have to be more observant and bring awareness to our bodily reactions and our initial thoughts. What are the judgmental thoughts that we are trying to bring awareness to have an understanding about? We really need to take the time to observe our initial reactions and thoughts when we're meeting a person. What are the first things that are coming up for us that are impacting the work and impacting our relation to others? Are we fielding out our judgmental thoughts and challenging our own beliefs in that moment? We have to be able to witness our own bodily mannerisms that may actually induce some idea of like privilege and power to the other person, right? So how are we showing up and how are we being perceived by others? Is there an understanding that there's privilege and power within the room? Are we able to tolerate the feelings in our body in response to those external stimuli? For example, I had a coworker. She was really a great attorney. And I was sitting in the courtroom and she and I were chatting about a case that she was dealing with, and she was having a crisis, right? She was texting a client in regards to trying to get her into treatment and trying to connect with her to be able to provide services to her to make sure that she was well. The young person was having, she was recently diagnosed with schizophrenia and having a really tough time dealing with it and processing that, and was not really on her medication. She didn't know what to do because this was a new experience for her. And the attorney had difficulty connecting with her because of a multitude of reasons. But she actually asked me if I could see this young person and speak to her, not because of my skills as a social worker or as a clinician, but because I was Black. And it was solely based on race. Now, in the moment, because I knew it was a crisis, I had a lot of questions, but I wanted to hold them back to really revisit another conversation when we could slow down and really talk through why it was important for that to be the primary focus of why I should support her in connecting with this client. I was able to effectively get her to work through the crisis, and then I had to revisit the conversation with her. And in our conversation, really had to talk about how she made me feel and how unimportant I was in terms of my skills that I had built up years of learning, and to be able to address the situation and address this crisis and to support her in the work. And what I found in the conversation, if I did not have the tolerance for that conversation, I would have had a set of ideas about who she was and how she showed up in the world that would have been completely different from who she was and what the real issue was. The real issue is that she really wanted to connect with the individual that we were serving. But instead, she actually based it solely on race. And we talked through her recognizing that she had an oops moment. And I encouraged her in the future to be able to acknowledge it when it did happen in that moment. Because I think for me, my understanding of how privilege works is that the person with the most perceived power and privilege in the room is the person who needs to acknowledge that it exists. So in that situation, it would have really been her as a white woman who was also an attorney, recognizing that the working situation, the working environment that I was in was, there were a lot of power dynamics that existed. And in the hierarchy, she had the most perceived power. And it was uncomfortable for me to address it, but I knew that I had to have that conversation because I was the one left feeling very uncomfortable about it. And I knew it would happen again. So oftentimes we, in this profession, we work with so many people that are different from us and in the myriad of ways, whether it be from eye color, hair color, skin color, height, weight. And we have to be able to find a way to come together and figure out how to support them and to connect with them in a way that could be useful and to use ourselves in the conversation to pivot that level of connectedness and not basing it solely on one identifying factor. So we need to take a step back and be willing to sit in those crucial and uncomfortable conversations. It was not bad that my coworker asked for help. It wasn't really great how it landed. And so she automatically assumed that I can help based on my appearance. And that's where the challenge lies in that conversation, right? I think that we have to be not only tolerant in uncomfortable situations, we have to be able to sit through these discussions and be mindful of asking questions that are equally beneficial to the consumer, right? So in that instance, my coworker could have gone to her client and said, I recognize that you are looking for someone who is also Black and can connect with you. However, is there another thing that I can support you on? Why don't we sit down and talk about ways in which I can support you best? So that she can be able to pivot herself in conversation and relation to that client and not basing it solely on race and identifying factors. Because easily that client could have turned to me and said, well, you don't have a mental illness, so what do you understand about my lifestyle and what I'm going through right now? So not only do we have to be able to tolerate those conversations, we have to increase objectivity to stimulate our own curiosity in the therapeutic process. Newer clinicians are a lot better at asking questions than more seasoned clinicians. When we make our first impressions, we typically pick up on a lot of differences and similarities. And for newer clinicians, they are able to hone in on a lot of questions because there's a lot of things that they don't know. There's a lot of judgments they haven't been able to formulate or create. And so when we're thinking about our preconceived ideas of people, we have to really step into what kind of questions would I've asked if I were a newer clinician, or if I didn't know anything about this population, or if I didn't know anything about this person. What kind of questions would I want to know the answers to that would be helpful in supporting that person? I had a case of a 16-year-old girl in the juvenile courts in New York, and she was charged with assault towards her adoptive mother. She was often penalized by the courts for not attending school. And over the 3 years that I've known her, I was able to document numerous accounts of her family members in real time basically reporting to me that she was not able to get into the home. She was not able to get changed. She was not able to be with the family. And she would be there hours on end in the hallway waiting to be let in with no avail. And for me, it was just being able to support her in her most vulnerable moments. By the 3 years, she was ready to go into foster care, and she asked to be placed into CPS custody. And that was rare for me because kids don't usually volunteer to go into ACS custody. When I actually advocated for her with ACS, Administration for Children's Services in New York City, they told me that she was a problem child. She was a bad child. And despite all the ways that I've been able to advocate for her, not only with her caseworker, I went up to the supervisor, I even went up to the manager who's never met this young person. And the manager had the same messaging. Oh, I've read her case file. She's a bad child. She's a problem child. And despite all the efforts that I made to try to get a safety conference, they kept denying me. Eventually, we were able to get a safety conference where I was able to shed more of a light around the nuances of this case so that they can eventually see this young 16-year-old as a person who is not bad, but is making very tough decisions with very little guidance. So I think that we have to be also very mindful that when we're using certain languages like problematic child, bad child, that really affects how we see our reality, right? The truth is that our reality is a social construct, and it is defined through language. Our narratives organize and maintains our realities. It is imperative that we understand that there are no internal truths. Understanding someone's lived truth is by deconstructing those narratives that we hold and we believe in so firmly, and how we communicate it is so crucial, right? Because language is a powerful tool in how we tell others of what we see this person to be. And so encouraging everybody to think about, is the way that I'm using phrasing like bad child, problematic child, non-compliant in our field, are those really supporting the person, or is it creating a label of disconnect and dis-ease within other providers? So as we're thinking about being radically curious, not only within ourselves, we have to also be radically curious with the people that we serve, because implicit biases denormalize, de-individualize, and also it creates a abnormal context for people that we work with, right? There's privilege and power in a therapeutic relationship, and each person enjoys those privileges granted by systems in prejudicial power. No matter how racial and revolutionary they might be, we must recognize that the benefits and costs of their privileges are equally important. We must take responsibility for our prejudice and actions which perpetuate oppression. Until we can clearly commit to an anti-oppressive practice, all forms of oppression will continue to divide our movements, and weaken our power. No single workshop is sufficient for us to learn to change our own behaviors or others' behaviors. We are all vulnerable to this oppressive system, and we need to be continuous in doing a lot of the internal work, and bringing it to the forefront in conversation with others. So when we're working with others, we have 3 things that we have to do. We have to normalize the situation, we have to individualize the situation, and we have to create a context around it. We have to contextualize it. So when we're normalizing, we look for ways to reduce the gulf between the client and the professionals. Understanding that normative behavior is around the cognitive development of a young person. Utilizing research on adolescent brain behavior and brain development and decision-making. We need to help others to understand the progress towards change is often incremental. So it is a marathon, it is not a sprint. I had a young person who was actually released before Raise the Age. And before ACS, Administration for Children's Services, took over a lot of the OCFS cases. And I had a young person who was on aftercare, and he returned home from being in OCFS facility, which is what I refer to as like little baby jail. And he had returned to his mother, who was a migrant from Jamaica, and he had three younger siblings. In working with this family to support him, I also had to be able to meet with his mother and his siblings to see how that they can best support him as well. In his reducing his recidivism, but also to make sure that he was connected to care and able to transition well into the community. Oftentimes, ACS was also involved in this case, and they deemed that this mother was too delayed to care for all of her children and were ready to remove all of the children from her home. Because I was there on a weekly basis, I saw a different lens of this mother and his family and how they interacted with one another. But also, I recognized that she had a very strong accent. And even though there were some minor delays, that did not impede in her being able to care for her children. And so I had to help the other professionals recognize that, yes, mom does have some delays and she does need some other supports, which we were actively helping her with, but they were inadequately assessing her because of her accent. And so trying to support her was really through assessing what her needs were. And I was able to recognize that she, instead of the delays, she actually had depression and was able to connect her to care appropriately. In addition to normalizing the situation, we have to also individualize situations. We have to be able to refer to our clients by name and not by number. Not only educating other professionals on why this client is special, like, does this person have a artistic talent or academic potential? Do they have a devoted guardian? Is his family's plan to move away from the neighborhood that got him arrested? We need to reduce the dichotomy between the client's need and a protection in the community. That can be through psychiatric evaluations and assessments, bringing them into the conversation to clarify if there's incongruence in the reports and assessments, having conversations not only with other professionals, but also with the client on what led to this report being formed in the way that it was formed. If we can invite people into those conversations, we can be able to give them back ownership in the conversation around how their lives are being narrated. We can even use support systems that are naturally in their lives, right? How are we able to use quotes and positive perspectives from other individuals in the community that are also involved? Are we able to also really focus and hone in on those strengths and not being deficit focused? So, for example, I had a young person who was also 15 years old, and this is another case that I had for approximately 3 years in the New York City juvenile courts. And he was in this court system for a very long time for the same reason as a young 16-year-old. He actually wasn't attending school at all. And after properly advocating for him at school, he was able to be reassessed for his IEP. And we learned for the first time in 15 years of his life that he had a learning disability, which was impeding his learning. And I was able to include that in the affidavit to the judge, because he should not be penalized for his case when he's been complying with all the services just because he wasn't attending school, and that appropriate services needs to be handled through the school and not through the courts. Fortunately for him, we were able to get his case dismissed and sealed. And if anybody is aware of how court systems work in getting a case dismissed, that's a pretty big deal, because that's like a golden ticket. It never really happens. In addition to normalizing and individualizing a situation, we have to contextualize a person's life, right? We have to present a picture that is broader than the sum of a client's behavior, addressing specific issues, concerns raised by the case or other parties in the assessments. we have to explain the context in which the actions that led to the client's adverse events occurred, right? Maybe that person lived in a shelter and they moved 3 times that year for whatever reason, maybe safety concerns, or maybe even just they were moved for any other reason. Or maybe even the person's parents were recently divorced, or the grandmother unexpectedly died 6 months ago. And that has been what has been impacting their behavior. I had another case of a young person who had been referred to me to family therapy and drug treatment. He was on probation and he was exhibiting a lot of aggressive behaviors. And upon meeting him through the documentation, I went in thinking, okay, I need to be concerned for my safety. Do I have to look out for anything that's going on? What would that look like? How do I take care of this? How do I safeguard myself or create a plan for myself when entering into this home? And when I walked into the home, I realized he was punching holes in the walls. So I knew there was pretty significant aggressive behaviors. When I spoke to him one-on-one outside of the family context, I realized that he had a lot more depressive symptoms than aggressive behaviors. And I spoke to him more about when those aggressive behaviors were more present and more prevalent for him. And I learned that he actually was becoming more upset in the morning time when it was time to get dressed and get ready for the morning, usually when his father came to wake him up in the morning. And when I did a genogram, I was able to recognize that there was more to this family than I realized initially. So I had to use my tool, my genogram, as a tool of engagement to understand the questions that I didn't have answers for. In recognizing and asking more about his family constitution, I was able to recognize that this young person had been through a lot of trauma, and as a result, had been self-medicating through marijuana. His parents were in a domestic violent relationship up until 3 years prior to me meeting with him. And the reason why it stopped was because he witnessed his mother having a cardiac arrest in front of him, and she flatlined. And watching at a very young age, his mother and father going through a domestic violent relationship, intimate partner violent relationship, and watching his mother literally die in front of him, it created a lot of trauma and unresolved feelings, and that he was not able to process because there was no space in his family to process it. And as a result, when he would get frustrated, he would become very aggressive and very upset. And instead of hurting and harming someone else in his family, he chose to avoid their faces and punched holes in the walls. So we were able to adequately get him services that were supportive for him. He needed time away from the family to be able to work on his coping mechanisms through an inpatient drug treatment program. So I was able to not only advocate for him to be able to go into the services, but I was also able to explain to the family and support them in understanding why he needed this space. Ultimately, radical curiosity encourages us to align with a person-centered thinking. How are we seeing this person as an individual? Most importantly, always starting with a person and also utilizing the collective wisdom. How are we able to come together as a community to be able to reestablish what our working relationships can look like that will be different from harming others? So when we're working with others, I think we have to recognize that all of us as working helping professionals who are in people professions, we want to be supportive to others. We don't want to create harm, but there are institutional practices that hinder us from building those relationships. It could be so simple to say, well, we could just show up and be curious in the spirit of being mindful. Well, we have to address the barriers that exist for us to hold the best holding environment for our clients. Power and privilege can play out in our group dynamics in very destructive ways. We must challenge supremacist practices which marginalize, exclude, and dehumanize others. Many of our agencies that we work in pose inflexibility and bureaucratic red tape that inhibit workers from being present for clients in a meaningful way. Many of the times, our organizations do not hold space for the provider to have continuous dialogue around equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice in an ongoing basis, and poses challenges because we all know that when these incidents of lack of power and privilege and equality occurs, agencies usually resort to the quick fixes like the one-day trainings to resolve all the problems and complexities that biases create. We have to recognize that our community relies on completing documentation and have certain expectation whether or not the consumer is ready to address the agency's need. Because staff cannot be their best selves and be in a healthy environment in a therapeutic relationship if they're not also feeling safe in the working environment. This hinders being radically curious, as they are forced to think more linearly so that things make more sense on paperwork. This serves the institutions, but not providing effective quality care. Therefore, we must extend the idea of being radically curious, not only to the working relationship with our interactions with consumers, but also with our colleagues, our interactions with our supervisors, and with our supervisees. We are all responsible for our agency cultures. We change the work culture. Continuous and open dialogue is necessary, and we need to learn how to listen non-defensively and communicate respectfully if we are going to have effective anti-oppressive practices. Create opportunities for people to develop skills and communicate about oppression. Commit time to organizational discussions and on discrimination and oppression, and to learn about each other, to share stories about our lives, our history, our culture, and our own experiences. It is important to set anti-oppressive goals, to promote anti-racist, anti-heterosexist, anti-transphobic, anti-ableism messages, and analyze everything that we do in and out of an activist space. At an organizational level, that means that we have to invite everyone to the table, and that's crucial. We're not just having clinical team meetings, but are we including all staff members, including the janitorial staff, including the receptionists, including the cleaning people, because they likely have a say in understanding of what they want this work culture to be as well. They likely have a say in understanding of their interactions with consumers if they have interactions with consumers. Additionally, supervisors and managers need to create a space that fosters workers to gain that perspective, think objectively and critically, and implement a plan of action as management supports this plan. The container that a supervisor holds for a worker is significant to maintain the stability of the workforce. It is also a parallel process for the worker to be able to create a holding environment for the consumer. The relationship between the worker and the supervisor is bidirectional, multifaceted, relational, and situational, which is why research on the topic is not always easily condensed. When people feel valued and have a sense of ownership in the work and feel connected to the agency's mission and vision, then job satisfaction increases, which allows them to be their best selves in their working environment. Recognition that the system's greatest asset and resource is the worker could be influential in making changes to reduce job stress, burnout, and even turnover. So that in turn can increase quality and treatment, because we all know that when these factors exist, that not only are we depleting the services provided for our consumers from being able to change hands and change workers and them not feeling that they are important. But we're also depleting the services of the people who remain in the workforce. We need to be able to address, how are we practicing in this way with each other? Are we able to have conversations around things that can be very challenging, not only about the documentation and the administrative needs of the organization? Like I said before, workers are the most instrumental resources that agencies have. Implementing organizational strategies and interventions, like increasing transparency, is vital in retaining highly skilled workers. Extensive research supports that motivational outcomes are increased by non-financial resources. The most influential factors towards feeling supported in the workplace are positive feelings like happiness, intimacy with peers, respect and appreciation from others, self-efficacy, hope, optimism, resilience, including psychological rewards and control in the job place. To affect change in systems, the leadership needs to focus on a climate that allows workers to feel supported. One of the ways that I propose that could work is to build in staff wellness policies. That might include self-care in the workplace, team retreats, networking, learning opportunities, even staff support groups once a week or twice a week, staff recognition that is publicized, and being able to allow the worker to feel like they are being refilled and refueled by not only by the interactions that they have with the consumers, but also by the agencies, upper management, by their supervisors, by their colleagues. So I do want to turn it over to everyone here. I know that there's opportunity for the chat. And I did want to ask a couple of questions on how do you practice, what practices do you have to remain grounded in asking questions? What are things that you normally do to support some of this work, the self-reflective practice? Because again, it is a practice. And if you could just type it in the chat. Remaining non-judgmental when asking questions. Taking seriously all questions. Yes, absolutely. Saying I wonder instead of I know, or implying I have an answer. Absolutely. So giving them back the say. Making supportive eye contact, open-ended questions, reflective, empathy, appropriate body language, absolutely. And then I'm wondering, what are some of the strategies that you use to share power with people that you serve? Reminding people that they're the experts of their lives, absolutely. Becoming a good listener.
Power.
Mm-hmm. Power sharing.
Oh, wow. Role-playing perspective taking is a big part of what I do.
For question 2, actively try to and put decision-making, no matter how small, into clients' hands, allowing client to choose. Absolutely. Showing interest in them in their situation. Absolutely. Asking questions and talking, I believe, less? Oh, talking last. Role-playing and perspective taking in a big part of what I do, and reinforce with the team. I found that challenging others who are set in their ways with beliefs will make positive growth if you make them think about how it could affect them in their shoes. Absolutely. Yeah, shifting the perspective is a really big thing, right? telling them they can do it. When I do have to break confidentiality, I bring them along in the process and try to do it in a way that makes them feel most comfortable. Absolutely. Yeah, I do the same thing, right? If I'm going to call CPS, I remind people of what my role is, and I remind them of what my expectations are and when I have to break confidentiality. And then I talk to them about the next steps. And then I remind them that I'm not going anywhere just because I've done this, right? And we're still going to have a working relationship with each other. Okay, perfect. These are really great comments. Thank you so much. And then the last one is, what are examples of power sharing in your work setting with colleagues, supervisors, and administration? So I know that could also be really hard, right? Sometimes we have to learn how to manage up. Having a good working relationship is paramount. Absolutely. How do people manage up, actually? What kind of conversations do they normally have to open the door for that? Asking questions and offering solutions. Absolutely. Discuss the power dynamic in the room. Suggesting a different way of doing things. Beautiful. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, y'all. Y'all have really, really great suggestions and thoughts about how you're already doing this work. So just for a quick recap, self-reflection presents some of the most powerful instructional opportunities in our workplaces. Its potency is in how it exercises multiple skills. We're talking about the skills that make us successful, such as critical thinking, personal responsibility, useful failure, adaptability, and much, much more. It's often overlooked, which is why we made it a crucial stage in the process, right? It's important for us to be able to debrief an interaction with an individual, but sometimes even in debrief an interaction with a coworker or even a manager. So processing all of the activities that happen within that interaction, the choices that were made, the discoveries that were made, and what didn't go so well. It's when we piece them together into a learning experience, even one or more aha moments that can be really impactful. So I just wanted to let everybody know that there are some resources, and there's much more than this, but I just want to highlight two things. Center for Nonviolent Communication is an agency that works around deconstructing language in a way that we can have more healthy communication. They have, I believe, free Mondays in the fall and the winter, where you can sit in on a meeting, but they also have traditional training courses around this. And we also have the Restorative Center that does restorative justice circles. They do trainings, they have free circles, and the trainings are to support the staff and to support everyone there as a volunteer, but to support a lot of the work that needs to be done on the administrative side. They actually do a lot of narrative storytelling in justice circles. And so I just left the information on how to connect with them here. But there's so many, especially now, there's so many other resources available to everyone. So again, I just want to take the time for just taking the moment to hear out what my thoughts are on radical curiosity and how we can show up a little bit differently. What were some key examples and on what I found in my work around practices and how I challenge myself to think of my practices differently. And I do want to turn it back over for any questions and comments.
Sure. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, so please feel free to chat in some questions. Folks made some great suggestions about how they engage in radical curiosity and power sharing. But Deidre, I have one, and that's, what are some tips for building trust with clients, especially when they understandably or can understandably distrust the larger systems that
Absolutely.
we're often a part of? I'm just curious your thoughts about that.
Absolutely.
How do you put that in context? Yeah.
Really glad that you asked. I think building trust is through action, right? We have to show up when we say we're going to show up. We have to do the things that we said we're going to do. We have to be consistent and reliable. And we have to demonstrate to them that we are going to be different in the way that we present ourselves in this profession, and that from other experiences that they might have had.
Right, right. Yeah, and just to follow up, though, I'm curious, you know, how it can be a really delicate balance, right, between helping young people or anyone that we're working with, right, understand these larger oppressive systems without beating up the system so badly. So, like, I'm wondering how you have those conversations, because as you're describing, a lot of your work is also helping people work through and navigate these oppressive systems, right?
Absolutely.
How do you put that in context? Yeah.
I think, you know, something that I've said a lot to a lot of my workers and a lot of interns is that sometimes we are in the forefront of sometimes the worst experiences of people's lives. And the most that we can really do is hold people's hands as they walk through the darkness. And when we're working with individuals, I think it's really to acknowledge that this is something that's happening, that it's not a figment of their imagination, because the system and the practices within the system can be pretty microaggressive, and it can leave a person feeling like, is this a reality that I'm experiencing or not? And so acknowledging it and naming it is really important. But also to be able to say, you know, let's join together and work collaboratively on there are things that we can do that are within our control. And what are some things that I can help you with? And what are some things that, you know, you would like to do independently? And what are things that we can do together? And so really just going through collaborative efforts as much as possible. But first and foremost, we have to acknowledge that this exists.
Yeah. And I think having those honest conversations can be incredibly powerful, and also help connect to the people we serve. So Deidre, we're short on time. We could probably spend a lot more time sort of having an open discussion, but thank you for this wonderful presentation. And Deidre, if you could advance the slide. Yeah, so these are some upcoming events that we have for folks. So please visit our CTAC site. We have Nurturing Resilience coming up on November 30th, 9 ways families, schools, and communities can help young people thrive. We have a webinar on eating disorders in vulnerable youth and teens. Big problem, as we hear and understand, big problem occurring in these post-COVID, or actually COVID times, I should say. And conversations with Dr. Tony Salerno, working with children using polyvagal theory, coming up on December 15th. Those are some of our future offerings. Next slide. Thank you, Deidre. And then, so please, thank you again for participating today. You should have received in the chat a link to our survey. Please take a moment to complete that survey and give us feedback. We always want to know how well this offering served your needs, and also any ideas you might have for future offerings. And then please, everyone, join me in thanking Dr. Deidre Williams for this amazing presentation and opportunity to discuss these ideas around radical curiosity. Thank you, Deidre.
Thank y'all so much.